The ship was falling, and Jake Morrison knew they were going to crash fire. Consumed the left wing while alarms screamed through the cockpit, but Jake kept his hands steady on the controls because that was what captains did, even when everything went wrong. The planet below was purple and green with massive forests that stretched beyond the horizon, and Jake aimed for a clearing between the trees. Because trees meant a softer landing than rock, the impact threw him forward against his restraints. And his head cracked against something hard, and then everything went dark for a time. He could not measure when Jake opened his eyes. The cockpit was filled with smoke and sparks, and the emergency hatch had blown open during the crash. He unbuckled himself and stumbled out into alien air that tasted like copper and flowers mixed together in a way that made his nose twitch. Forest around him was silent, except for the crackling of his dying ship, and Jake reached for his sidearm out of pure instinct, because quiet forests after crashes usually meant something was watching. He was right. She stepped out from between the trees, and Jake forgot how to breathe for several very long seconds. The woman was tall and elegant with silver hair that caught the light of two suns overhead, and her skin was pale, like moonlight on snow. Her eyes were violet and sharp, and they studied Jake like he was a puzzle she needed to solve quickly. She wore armor that seemed to be made from metal that glowed with its own inner light, and in her hand was a sword that hummed with energy Jake could feel in his bones. Behind her came the dragon. Jake had seen pictures of dragons in old Earth books, but those were nothing compared to the real thing. The creature was massive with scales the color of fresh blood and wings that blocked out the purple sky when it spread them wide. Smoke curled from its nostrils, and its eyes burned like molten gold, and Jake knew with absolute certainty that it could kill him. Faster than he could blink, the woman spoke in a language that sounded like music and wind chimes, and Jake frantically grabbed for his translator device, which had somehow survived the crash. He pressed the button and spoke what he hoped was a greeting. Based on the 3 days of cultural briefing he had received before this mission, the woman went very still, and her pale cheeks suddenly flushed a deep red that spread down her neck, and Jake wondered if he had just insulted her somehow. Dragon made a sound that could have been a laugh if dragons could laugh, and the woman shot at a glare that would have melted steel before Jake could apologize for whatever he had done wrong. The sky above them lit up with plasma fireships screamed overhead, and the forest exploded into flame, and Jake dove for cover as the woman moved faster than his eyes could track her. Sword cut through incoming fire, and the dragon launched itself into the air with a roar that shook the ground beneath Jake's feet. Watched in amazement as the woman fought with grace and precision while her dragon burned enemy ships from the sky with flame, so hot it turned the air white. The attackers were insects, or at least they looked like insects, but they were the size of humans, and they carried weapons that fired green energy that melted everything it touched. Jake pulled his sidearm and started firing because sitting still meant dying, and his military training kicked in despite the insanity of the insanity. Hit 3 of the insect soldiers before one of them got close enough to nearly take his head off with a blade covered in something that hissed and bubbled. The woman appeared between them, and her sword took the insect's head clean off, and she grabbed Jake by the arm and started running. The dragon landed in front of them, and the woman threw Jake onto its back and climbed up behind him, and then they were flying. The wind screamed past Jake's ears, and he grabbed onto the dragon's scales, which were warm and smooth like polished stone. The woman pressed against his back and shouted something in his ear, and the translator crackled to life. She was telling him to hold on tight because they were going underground. The dragon folded its wings and dove straight down toward what looked like solid rock, but at the last second, a hole opened up and they plunged into darkness. Jake felt the woman's arms wrap around him as they fell, and her heartbeat thundered against his back, and he realized she was just as scared as he was, even if she hid it better. They landed hard in a cavern lit by glowing moss that covered the walls in patches of blue and green light. The dragon shook itself like a wet dog, and Jake slid off its back onto stone that was surprisingly smooth. The woman dismounted with far more grace and started speaking quickly while gesturing at the tunnel they had come through. Jake's translator worked overtime to keep EPHSLT. People were called the Kraviks, and they were empire builders who consumed everything in their path the woman's people were the ether-born elves, and they had been fighting the Kravix for longer than human. Civilization had existed. The dragon's name was Emberian, and he was not a pet but a soul, bonded companion, which was apparently very different and very important. Woman's name was Lyria Shadowthorn, and she was a warrior commander who had been fighting on this planet for 3 years. Jake introduced himself and tried to apologize for whatever he had said earlier that made her blush. Lyria's face went red again, and she looked away and explained in halting words that Jake's translator had turned his greeting into something else entirely. He had basically called her cute in a way. That among her people meant he wanted to marry her. Jake felt his own face go hot, and he stammered out an apology, but Lyria held up a hand and said it was fine because humans could not be expected to understand Elven custom. Siberian made that laughing sound again, and Lyria threw a small rock at the dragon's head, which bounced off harmlessly. Jake asked what they should do next, and Lyria's expression turned serious. The Kravix were here for something called the Sacred Nexus, which was buried deep beneath this planet. If the Kravix got the Nexus, they would use it to destroy everything, including Earth, which was very far away but not far, and Illyria had been trying to reach the Nexus first to seal it permanently, but her backup had been killed in an ambush 2 days ago. Now she was alone, except for Emberian, and apparently one very confused human who had crashed at exactly the wrong time and place. Jake looked at the glowing walls and the massive dragon and the beautiful warrior woman, who was still slightly pink around the ears. He thought about his crew who might still be alive somewhere on this planet, and his duty to return home and report. Then he thought about the Kravix destroying Earth, and everyone he had ever known. The choice, it was pretty simple when he looked at it. That why Jake told Lyria he would help her reach the Nexus and seal it, because that was what needed to happen. Lyria studied him with those violet eyes, and something shifted in her expression. She nodded once and said they would leave at dawn because the tunnels were dangerous, even with Emberian's fire to light the way that night. Jake sat against the cavern wall while Emberian curled around them both like a massive warm barrier against the cold. Lyria sat nearby, sharpening her sword, and Jake asked her why Emberian kept looking at him. Strange. Illyria was quiet for a long moment before she explained that dragons could sense bonds between souls. Emberian thought Jake and Lyria were becoming connected, which should be impossible because they had just met. But dragons were never wrong about these things, which meant something strange was happening. Jake wanted to ask more, but Lyria had already turned away, and her shoulders were tense in a way that said the conversation was over. So Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep while Emberian's breathing rumbled through the stone, and somewhere far above the Kravix searched for them in the burning forest. Tomorrow they would go deeper into the planet and try to save the universe. But tonight Jake let himself think about violet eyes and silver hair and the way Lyria had held him tight when they were falling through darkness. Maybe the dragon was right about the bond. Maybe that would be a problem, but problems could wait until tomorrow, because right now Jake was alive, and that was enough. 3 days in the underground tunnels changed everything Jake thought he knew about fighting, and Servi Valeria moved through the darkness like she was born to it, and her sword never stopped glowing with that strange inner through passages that seemed too small for a dragon, but somehow he always fit. Jake followed behind with his gun ready and his translator working constantly to keep up with Lyria's warnings about traps and unstable floors. The ruins were old beyond imagining, with walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at for too long. Lyria explained that this place was built by people who came before even the elves, and they had powers that modern races could only dream about. The Sacred Nexus was their greatest creation and their biggest mistake, because it contained something that should never have existed. Jake asked what that something was, but Lyria only said he would understand when they got there. On the second day they were attacked by Kravix hunters who had found their trail. The tunnels erupted into chaos, with plasma fire lighting up the ancient walls. Jake took cover behind a fallen pillar and started shooting, while Aria charged forward with her sword singing through the air. She moved so fast she seemed to blur, and her blade cut through Kravix's armor like it was paper, but there were too many of them, and Jake saw one getting into position behind her with a weapon that crackled with green lightning. He shouted a warning and fired 3 shots that took the Kravix down. Lyria spun and nodded at him, and something passed between them in that moment they started fighting together with. Jake calling out enemy positions while Lyria used her speed and strength to cut them down then. Emberian arrived, and the battle became a slaughter. The dragon's fire filled the tunnel with heat so intense that Jake had to shield his face. Kravik screamed as they burned, and the smell was horrible, but Jake kept firing because stopping meant dying. It was over. They stood among smoking corpses, and Lyria looked at Jake with something like respect. She said he fought well for a human, and Jake said she fought well for an Emberian. Rumbled and pushed his massive head against Jake's chest like a cat seeking attention. Jake reached up without thinking and scratched under the dragon's jaw, and Emberian made a sound of pure pleasure. Lyria froze and stared at them with wide eyes. She said that Emberian never let strangers touch him, and Jake asked if that was a problem. Lyria said she did not know yet, but her face had that pink tinge again. They rested in a chamber with walls covered in star maps that showed galaxies Jake had never heard of. Lyria sat by a small fire and pulled out a journal. Made from some kind of leather, she started sketching, and Jake asked what she was drawing. Lyria showed him pages filled with animals from Earth based on his descriptions during their walk. She had drawn cats with too many legs and horses with wings, and Jake laughed because they were adorable, even if they were wrong. Lyra's face went bright red, and she closed the journal quickly. Jake realized what he had said, and the translator had done it again. He had called her adorable, which apparently had even more serious implications than Lyria stood up and walked to the far side of the chamber, and Jake followed because he needed to understand what was happening. She turned to face him, and her violet eyes were troubled. She explained that among her people, words like cute and adorable were only used between bonded mates. By saying these things, Jake had essentially proposed marriage twice. But the strange part was that Lyria could feel something happening between them. She could sense his emotions at the edges of her mind, which should only happen with someone she had bonded with intentionally. Emberian had already claimed Jake as clutch kin, which meant family in dragon terms. Something was forming between them whether they wanted it or not. Jake asked if that was a bad thing, and Lyria was quiet for a long time. She said her people lived for thousands of years, and bonds were sacred and permanent. She said Jake was human and would die in what felt like a heartbeat to an elf. She said the war had taken everyone she had ever loved, and she could not afford to lose anyone else. Jake understood loneliness and loss because war had taken people from him. He told Lyria that life was short and uncertain, and maybe that was why humans grabbed onto good things when they found them. He told her that he did not understand elven bonds or dragon magic, but he knew they worked well together. He told her that he had called her cute by accident, but maybe some accidents were meant to happen. Lyria looked at him with tears in her violet eyes, and she said humans were foolish and brave in equal measure then. She kissed him, and it felt like falling and flying at the same time. Emberian roared his approval, and the sound echoed through the ancient halls when they finally pulled apart. Lyria was smiling, and Jake realized he had never seen her smile before. She said the bond was forming, whether they fought it or not, so they might as well accept it. Jake said he could accept that, and Lyria laughed. And the sound was like music. Their moment was interrupted by static. On Jake's emergency communicator, a voice crackled through, and Jake recognized Katie Sullivan, his second-in-command. Katie had survived the crash with 6 other crew members, and they had made contact with an elven fleet in orbit. But there was a problem. The Elven High Command had declared Lyria a deserter for not returning to the front line. She was supposed to report back after the ambush killed her team, but instead she had stayed on the planet. Now she faced execution for abandoning her duty. Jake felt cold rage flood through him because Lyria had stayed to protect the Nexus. She had stayed because it was the right thing to. Lyria touched his arm gently and said it was fine because she had always known this might happen. She said duty came before personal desires, and the elven military did not forgive desertion. Said that was stupid, and Lyria agreed, but said it was still the law. Emberian growled, and fire leaked from his jaws because he was angry. Jake made a decision then that would change everything. Told Katie to arrange a meeting with the Elven High Command. He told her to inform them that Captain Jake Morrison of Earth had information vital to the war effort. He told her to make sure they understood that he would only speak with Lyria. Katie asked if he knew what he was doing, and Jake said absolutely not, but he was doing it anyway. Lyria looked at him with wonder and asked why. He would risk himself for her. Jake said it was because she had saved him and because the bond was real, if they had just met. He said it was because she deserved better than execution for doing the right. He said it was because he had called. Her cute, and he meant Illyria, kissed him again, and this time Emberion wrapped his wings around them both, like a shield against the world. Tomorrow they would face the elven military and try to save Lyria from her own people. Tomorrow they would explain about the Nexus and the Kravix threat, but tonight they had each other and a dragon who thought this was all very romantic. The bond grew stronger with every heartbeat, and Jake could feel Lyria's emotions mixing with his own fear and hope and something that might have been love. If love could form this fast, Emberion rumbled contentedly, and Jake realized the dragon had known all along some bonds were meant to be, whether they made sense or not. Sometimes accidents led to exactly where you needed to go. The surface of Valoria Prime was burning when they emerged from the tunnel. Skravik ships hung in the sky like dark clouds, and their weapons carved glowing scars across the landscape. Vessels fought back with beams of captured starlight that turned Kravix dreadnoughts into expanding clouds of debris. Human ships darted between the giants, firing missiles that seemed like insect bites. Compared to the elven weapons, Jake watched the battle and felt small and useless because this was war. On a scale Earth had never seen. Lyria stood beside him, with her hand on his shoulder, and through the bond he felt her sadness at seeing her world destroyed. Emberion launched into the air with a roar and joined the fight because dragons did not hide when there was fighting to be done. A shuttle dropped from the elven fleet and landed near them with engines that made no sound. Katie stepped out, followed by human marines in full combat gear, and she saluted Jake before pulling him into a hug. She said she was glad he was alive, and also asked if he had lost his mind. Jake introduced Lyria, and Katie's eyes went wide, because even through armor, it was obvious Lyria was not human. Katie asked if this was going to be a problem, and Jake said probably. Yes, but it was too late to worry about that now. They flew up to the elven flagship, which was a vessel so large it had its own gravity. Interior was all flowing curves and crystal that pulsed with light, and Jake felt completely out of place. Lyria walked with her head high. Even though she was heading to her own trial, the command chamber was filled with elven officers who looked at Jake and his crew like they were interesting insects. At the center sat Commandant Arya Nightwhisper, who was old even by elven standards, with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. She spoke, and the translator struggled because her dialect was ancient and formal. She said Lyria had broken sacred oaths by abandoning her post. She said the punishment for desertion during wartime was death by sword. She said Lyria would be executed at dawn unless she could provide a reason why the law should not apply. Jake stepped forward before Lyria could speak. He said he had information about the Kravix plan and the sacred Nexus. He said Earth had been monitoring Kravix communications and had discovered their true goal. The Kravix did not want to use the Nexus as a weapon. They wanted to open it and release what was inside. The elven commanders went very still, and Arya leaned forward with eyes that suddenly burned with intensity. She asked how humans could possibly know about what the Nexus contained. Jake said human scientists were very good at intercepting alien communications, even when they were not supposed to. He said the Kravix believed the Nexus held something called the Void Serpent. He said the Kravix thought releasing it would give them godlike power. Arya stood, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. She said the Void Serpent was a being that existed outside normal reality. She said it consumed entire dimensions and left nothing but emptiness behind. She said the elves had been guarding its prison for 10,000 years. She said if the Kravix released it, then every living thing in the galaxy would die. Screaming, the room erupted into chaos with commanders shouting in multiple languages. Jake waited for silence and then made his proposal. He said humans could help. He said human technology was different from elven magic and Kravix bioweapons. He said humans specialized in tactics and coordination and electronic warfare. Said if the three species worked together, they might stop the Kravix before they reached the Nexus. The elven commanders laughed, and Arya silenced Then with a gesture she asked why she should trust a species that had only just reached the stars. Jake said, because they had no choice, and time was running out. He said the Kravix would reach the Nexus in 3 days based on their current advance. Said pride was a luxury. They could not afford. Arya studied him for a long time, and then turned her gaze to Lyria. Asked if Lyria trusted this human. Lyria stepped forward, and her voice was clear and strong. She said Jake had fought beside her against. The Kravix said he had saved her life, and she had saved his, she said. Emberian had claimed him as clutchkin, which was a bond dragons did not make lightly. She said more than that Jake was her bonded mate by the old laws. The room went absolutely silent. Katie grabbed Jake's arm and whispered that he really should have mentioned that detail. Arius' expression could have frozen. She said bonds were sacred, but they required formal approval from the high command. She said Lyria had formed a bond without permission and with an alien species. She said this was another violation added to desertion. Lyria said the bond had formed naturally and could not be undone. She said fighting it would only cause pain for both of them. She said Jake had proven himself worthy through combat and courage. She said if the high command wished to execute her, then so be it, but they should listen to Jake's plan first. Jake felt Lyria's fear through the bond, but also her determination. He spoke up and said he would submit to any tests the elves required to prove the bond was real. He said he would undergo their ceremonies and follow their law. Jake said all he asked was that they let Lyria help defend the Nexus because she knew the tunnels better than anyone. Arya was silent, and Jake could feel the weight of her years pressing down on the room. Finally she spoke. She said the trial would be postponed until after the Kravix were defeated, or they were all dead. She said Jake's plan would be considered, but he would have to prove human technology was worth the risk. She said if they succeeded, Lyria would be pardoned and the bond would be recognized. She said if they failed, then execution would be the least of their worries. The commanders began planning. Immediately, human ships would provide sensor nets and jamming to disrupt Kravix coordination. Elven vessels would engage the dreadnoughts with overwhelming firepower. Ground forces would assault the Nexus Temple to stop the ritual if the fleet failed. Lyria volunteered to lead the ground assault with Emberian. Jake insisted on going with her, because the bond meant he could feel when she was in danger. Katie pulled him aside and asked if he understood what he was doing. She said bonding with an alien was going to cause massive problems with Earth Command. She said he was risking his career and possibly his freedom. Jake said he knew, but some things were more important than careers. He said Lyria was fighting to save everyone, including Earth. He said the least he could do was stand beside her at Katie's side, and said she would cover for him as long as she could. She said he better not get killed because she did not want to explain this to Admiral Lisa Cortez. The fleet prepared for battle, and Jake stood with Lyria on the observation deck, watching ships move into formation. She leaned against him, and he felt her warmth through the bond. She said she was sorry for bringing him into her war. Jake said he was not sorry at all. He said meeting her was the best accident he had ever had. Lyria smiled, and it was sad and beautiful. She said humans were strange and wonderful. She said she hoped they both survived to see what their bond could become. Emberian found them and curled around them both. Dragon's emotions flooded through the bond, and Jake felt his absolute certainty that they would. Wind dragons did not doubt and did not fear. They fought and they protected and they loved with everything they were. Jake drew strength from that certain tide. They would face the Kravix and the Void Serpent tomorrow. They would fight for the universe, but tonight they were together, and that was enough. Bond pulsed between them, growing stronger with every moment. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The jump to the Nexus system broke every law of physics Jake had ever learned. Stars burned in colors that did not exist, and gravity pulled in directions that made his stomach twist. Reality itself was coming apart at the seams because the Kravix had already started the ritual. Katie's voice crackled over the cum from the Endeavor, saying sensors were going crazy. Time was moving at different speeds in different parts of the system. The human destroyer had aged 1,000 years in seconds, and crumbled to dust. Another had reverted to raw metal or floating in space. Elven fleet pushed forward with shields of woven starlight that held back the worst of the reality storms. Jake coordinated from the Endeavor's bridge, while Lyria prepared For the ground assault through the bond, he felt her checking weapons and calming. Emberian, who wanted to burn everything the Kravik's fleet, was massive with living ships that pulsed and breathed. The center was the Nexus Temple, which looked like a black crystal the size of a moon. Cracks ran across its surface, and through those cracks leaked darkness that swallowed light. Jake ordered the human ships to begin jamming, and the Kravik's formation immediately started breaking apart without coordination. The insect warriors fell into chaos, and the elven dreadnoughts tore into them, but there were so many Kraviks that even chaos was dangerous. Battle became a grinding mess of ships exploding, and reality-warping Galeria's dropship launched from the flagship with 50 elven warriors and Emberian clinging to the hull. Jake watched on screens as they dove through the fire toward the temple. Then alarms screamed as a reality storm caught them. The dropship twisted, and Jake felt Lyria's fear spike. Through the bond, he felt her grab onto something as gravity reversed. He felt Emberian roar and breathe fire to burn through the storm itself. Ship punched through and headed for the temple entrance. Jake should have stayed on the bridge. He should have kept coordinating the fleet, but through the bond he felt Lyria's ship get hit by Kravik's fire. He felt the hull breach and warriors sucked into space. He felt her determination to reach the temple, even if she went alone. Katie shouted at him as he ran for the hangar. She said he was fleet command and could not abandon his post. Jake said Lyria was going to die without support. He said he could feel her through the bond and she needed help. Katie swore and said she would take over coordination. Said he better come back alive. Jake stole a dropship and launched before anyone could stop him. The flight through the reality storm was like being inside a nightmare. His ship's hull turned to crystal, then back to metal, then to something that looked like living tissue. Jake gritted his teeth and flew by instinct. 'Cause instruments were useless, he crashed through the storm and saw the temple. Ahead, Lyria's ship was down and burning Kraviks swarmed over it like ants. Emberian stood over Lyria breathing fire in great sweeping arcs. Jake brought his ship down hard and grabbed every weapon he could carry. Ran out shooting, and Kraviks turned to face this new threat. Jake fought like a man possessed, because through the bond he could feel Lyria wounded and struggling. He cut through Kraviks with plasma fire, and Grenadierian saw him and roared recognition. The dragon's tail swept a dozen Kraviks into the air. Together they fought their way to Lyria, who was on her feet but bleeding from a deep cut across her ribs. She saw Jake and her eyes went wide. She asked what he was doing here through the bond, because speaking was too hard. Jake said he was keeping her alive because that was what bonded mates did. Lyria smiled despite the pain and said he was an idiot. Jake said he had been called worse. They pushed into the temple with Emberian burning a path forward. Interior was worse than the outside. Reality bent and twisted, and Jake saw things that should not exist the Kraviks had merged with. The temple itself becoming living parts of the structure. At the center was the Empress. She was enormous and terrible. Her body was part insect and part cosmic. Horror. She had merged with the Void Serpent's essence, and her voice echoed from dimensions beyond counting. She said they were too late. She said the seal was almost broken. She said she would become a god and devour reality. Its Sylphyria raised her sword, and the blade blazed with light. She said the Empress would die before that happened. Battle that followed was chaos made solid. The Empress wielded powers that bent space and time. She killed elven warriors with a gesture. She turned gravity into a weapon that crushed and tore, but Lyria fought with the fury of her ancestors. Jake provided covering fire and called out attacks. He could see coming. Emberian burned with flame so hot it scorched the air white. They fought as one unit. Jake felt Lyria's exhaustion through the bond. He felt her wounds bleeding. He felt her determination to win, or die trying. The Empress laughed and said they were insects trying to fight a storm. Jake looked at the temple structure and saw an idea. He told Lyria through the bond to get the Empress under the central supports. Lyria trusted him without question. She charged, and the Empress followed Emberian and herded the monster with walls of flame wind. The Empress was in position. Jake detonated every explosive he had brought. The temple shook and supports cracked. The Empress screamed as tons of ancient stone fell. On her Lyria ran, and Jake caught her as debris rained down. Emberian shielded them both with wings that were scarred and smoking when the dust cleared. The Empress was pinned and bleeding, but she was still reaching for the nexus Lyria stood on. Shaking legs, she said her sword was forged from the same material as the seal. She said if she struck true, she could reseal the... Next as Jake said she was too weak. Lyria said she had to try. Jake felt her gather every bit of strength she had left. He felt her pour everything into the bond. Suddenly he understood. The bond did not just share emotions. It could share power. Jake grabbed her hand and pushed his strength through the connection. Lyria gasped as human determination flooded into Harem. Birion added his fire to the bond. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Lyria charged, and her sword blazed like a star. Empress tried to stop her, but Jake's grenades and Emberion's fire kept her pinned. Lyria's blade struck the seal in reality. Screamed for one terrible moment. Jake saw the void serpentine was vast beyond comprehension. It looked at him with eyes that contained dying universes. It recognized Lyria's bloodline as the ones who had imprisoned it. It raged, but the seal was already reforming. Lyria drove her sword deeper, and the seal locked into place. Empress shrieked as she was severed from the serpent's power. The temple began to collapse. Jake grabbed Lyria and ran Emberion, scooped them both up, and launched into the air. As the temple fell, they burst out into space where the battle still raged. Katie's voice came through, saying the Kravik's fleet was retreating. The ritual had failed, and their empress was gone. Victory. There's Jake held Lyria as Emberion flew them back to the fleet. She was unconscious but alive through the bond. He felt her dreaming. She was dreaming of peace and a future where the war was over. Jake promised himself he would give her that future, whatever it took. They had saved the universe now. Just had to survive the aftermath. Recovery took 6 weeks, and Jake spent every moment he could at Lyria's side in the medical bath. Elven healer said she would live, but the wounds went deep. Her body would heal, but her spirit needed rest. Jake through the bond he sent her strength. Katie visited daily to update him on the political situation. Earth Command was very interested in the human who had bonded with an alien warrior. The Elven High Command was divided on whether to honor their promise. About the bond, the Kraviks had retreated, but they were regrouping. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Jake did not care about politics. He only cared that Lyria opened her violet eyes and smiled at him when she finally woke fully. The first thing she did was ask if Emberion was safe. The dragon had been sleeping outside the medical bay for weeks. He heard Lyria's voice. He pushed his massive head through the door and rumbled with joy. Healers complained, but Emberion ignored them. He pressed his snout against Lyria's hand, and she laughed. The sound made Jake's heart sink. A Mantan Arya visited on the 7th week. She looked at Jake and Lyria, and something softened in her ancient eyes. She said they had proven the bond was real. Through their actions, she said the High Command had voted to recognize it officially. She said there would need to be a proper ceremonial area. Sat up despite the healer's protests. She said she would undergo any ceremony required. Jake agreed because he would do whatever it took to stay with her. Arya smiled slightly and said they might regret that enthusiasm. Bonding ceremonies were complex and involved fire. Jake
Dick looked at Emberia
and said he was getting used to fire. The ceremony was planned for 3 weeks later on Valoria Prime, which was being rebuilt. Human and elven construction crews worked side by side. It was the first real cooperation between the species. Katis said it was a good sign. Admiral Lisa Cortez arrived from Earth with an entire delegation. She pulled Jake aside and asked if he knew what he was doing. Jake said he had never been more certain of anything. Cortez sighed and said Earth Command wanted him as a liaison between species. She said his bond with Lyria made him uniquely qualified. She said it would be dangerous and difficult. Jake said he expected nothing less. Ceremony took place at sunset with both human and elven witness. Eslia wore armor polished to a mirror. Jake wore his dress uniform, which felt inadequate compared to elven finery. Katie stood beside him as his chosen sister, which made her family an elven traditional. Birion officiated because bonding ceremonies were a dragon's sacred duty. The dragon spoke in a voice that rumbled through the ground. He said bonds were rare and precious. He said Jake and Lyria had proven their bond in combat and sacrifice. He said they would be tested again and again. He said if they stood together, nothing could break them. Lyria took Jake's hand and spoke. Vows in her language the translator gave him the meaning she promised to stand with him against all threats, promised to share her strength and accept his. She promised to love him for however long they had jaked, spoke his own vows in halting Elvenaw, promised to protect her with everything he was. He promised to honor her people and their ways. He promised to never regret the accident that brought them together, and Borean breathed fire over them both. The flame was hot, but did not burn. It wrapped around them like a blanket through the bond. Jake felt the fire sealed their connection permanently. They were one now in a way that went beyond words when. The flame faded. Lyria's eyes were bright with tears. She kissed Jake and everyone cheered. Evria was smiling. The celebration lasted late into the night. Humans and elves drank together and shared stories. Katie got slightly drunk and told embarrassing tales about Jake's Academy de Celeria, laughed until she creed Emberian, ate an entire roasted ox, and declared it acceptable. In the quiet hours before dawn, Jake and Lyria stood on a balcony overlooking the rebuilt city. She had her journal out and was sketching. Jake looked over her shoulder and saw she had drawn Earth's moon over an elven landscape. He asked if she was planning their honeymoon. Lyria blushed that deep red he had come to love. She said humans had strange customs. She said among her people bonded mates did not take vacations. They took oaths of service together. Jake asked what kind of service. Ilaria explained that she had been offered command of the first joint human-elven outpost. It would be located on the border between their territories. Its mission would be to prevent future wars through cooperation. She wanted to know if Jake would serve with her. Jake said there was nowhere else he would rather. But Lyria smiled and leaned against him. She said home was where the heart was, according to human sayings. She said her heart was with him, so anywhere was. Emberian joined them on the balcony. The dragon rumbled contentedly through the bond. Jake felt the dragon's satisfaction. Emberian had known from the beginning that they belonged together. Dragons were never wrong about bonds. Katie's voice interrupted over the cum. She said they had first contact alerts in Sector 7A. New species was asking to meet the human-elf liaison team. Specifically, word had spread about their victory over the Kravixother species, wanted to know if the alliance was real. Jake looked at Lyria and saw excitement in her eyes. She asked if he was ready for another adventure. Jake said as long as she was with him, he was ready for anything. They went to the ship together with Emberian flying overhead. Katie met them at the hangar with a grin. She said the universe was about to get very interesting. The new species were called the Meridians, and they had their own problems with the Kravixi. Wanted to join the alliance. They wanted protection and offered resources. It was the beginning of something bigger than any of them had imagined. As their ship launched toward Sector 7, Jake held Lyria's hand through the bond. He felt her confidence and her love. He thought about how far they had come from that first meeting in the burning forest. He had called her cute by accident. She had blushed deep red. Dragon had decided they were meant to be now. They were saving the galaxy one species at a time. Illyria squeezed his hand and smiled. She said he should try not to accidentally propose to any of the Meridians. Jake laughed and said he would do his best, but with his luck and the translator he made no promise. Emberian roared from the cargo bath. The sound echoed through the ship, was a declaration that wherever they went together. One human who stumbled into destiny, one elven warrior who found her match, one dragon who knew all along the war might be over, but their story was just beginning, and Jake could not wait to see what came next.